Close your eyes now and let me take you back to the coldest time in human memory. Not cold like a winter morning when you can see your breath. Not cold like a freezer or a snow-covered mountain. Cold like nothing you have ever experienced. Cold that would kill you in minutes if you stepped outside unprepared. Cold that covered half the world in ice miles thick and turned the other half into frozen grassland where survival was never guaranteed and death was always waiting. This is the story of the last ice age and how your ancestors survived it. This is the story of the most challenging time in human history, when the world itself seemed determined to freeze us out of existence, and we refused to die. This is the story of resilience and adaptation, of technology and cooperation, of the human spirit facing impossible odds and finding a way through. And it is a story that matters to you lying there in the warmth of your bed, because you are here tonight only because your ancestors survived what I am about to describe. Every single one of them made it through the cold. Every single one found food when food was scarce, found warmth when warmth meant survival, found the strength to keep going when giving up would have been so much easier. Their strength is your inheritance, their survival is your existence, and their story deserves to be told as you drift towards sleep, carried by the knowledge that you come from people who could not be broken, not even by an ice age. The last ice age began around 115,000 years ago, though it did not begin suddenly. The climate cooled gradually over thousands of years, the summers growing slightly shorter, the winters slightly longer, the snow on the mountains lasting a little later into spring each year. At first, no one would have noticed. The changes were too slow, too subtle, measured in generations rather than years, but the ice was coming. It always comes eventually. The Earth breathes in cycles we are only beginning to understand, cycles of warming and cooling driven by the wobble of our planet on its axis, by the shape of our orbit around the Sun, by factors we may not yet have discovered. For most of the last 2 million years, the Earth has been in an ice age more often than not. The warm periods we call interglacials are the exception, not the rule. We happen to live in one of those warm exceptions, an interglacial that began about 12,000 years ago and will eventually end, giving way to another advance of the ice, another test of human resilience, another chapter in the long story of survival that defines our species. But that future ice age is not our concern tonight. Tonight we are focused on the past, on the last glacial maximum that occurred around 26,000 to 19,000 years ago, when the ice sheets reached their greatest extent, and the world was colder than it had been in 100,000 years. This was the time when survival was hardest, when the margins were thinnest, when our ancestors faced challenges that would seem almost impossible to us today. And they made it through. Let me paint a picture of what the world looked like at the height of the last ice age. Imagine standing in what is now New York City, except there is no city, no buildings, no roads, no sign that humans have ever been here. There is only ice, a wall of ice rising hundreds of feet into the air, stretching from horizon to horizon, covering everything you can see and extending thousands of miles in every direction. This is the Laurentide ice sheet, the massive glacier that covered most of Canada and the northern United States during the Ice Age. It contained so much water that sea levels around the world dropped by nearly 400 feet. It was so heavy that it pressed the land beneath it down into the Earth's crust, land that is still rebounding today, thousands of years after the ice melted away. The ice sheet was not static. It moved slowly but inexorably, grinding across the landscape, scraping away soil and rock, carving valleys and depositing debris. It created the Great Lakes, those enormous bodies of fresh water that dot the American Midwest. It shaped the landscape of northern Europe and Asia as well, where similar ice sheets covered Scandinavia, Siberia, and the British Isles. At its maximum extent, ice covered about 30% of the Earth's land surface, compared to about 10% today. The rest of the world was transformed by the Ice Age even where glaciers did not reach. The climate was colder and drier almost everywhere. Forests retreated toward the equator, replaced by grasslands and tundra. Deserts expanded as rainfall decreased. Sea levels dropped so dramatically that land bridges appeared where there is now ocean, between Asia and North America, between Britain and Europe, between Australia and New Guinea. Animals that could adapt to the cold thrived. The Mammoth Steppe, that vast grassland that stretched from Western Europe across Asia to Alaska, supported enormous herds of woolly mammoths, woolly rhinoceroses, horses, bison, reindeer, and dozens of other large mammals. It was one of the most productive ecosystems the world has ever seen, an Arctic Serengeti that fed the predators at the top of the food chain, including humans. This was the world your ancestors inhabited. This was the world they had to survive in, not for a winter or a year, but for thousands of years, generation after generation, with no promise that the cold would ever end. They had no way of knowing that they lived in an ice age. They had no concept of climate change or glacial cycles. They knew only that the world was cold and harsh and demanding, that survival required every ounce of skill and knowledge and cooperation they could muster, that life was short and death was always close at hand. And yet they thrived. Not just survived, but thrived. The population of humans during the Ice Age was small by modern standards, perhaps a few million people scattered across the habitable portions of Europe, Asia, Africa, and the Americas. But those few million represented the entire future of humanity. Every person alive today descends from those Ice Age survivors. Every nation, every culture, every family line traces back to people who made it through the cold. We are all children of the Ice Age, inheritors of adaptations and traditions and genetic variations that helped our ancestors survive when survival seemed almost impossible. Let me tell you how they did it. Let me walk you through the technologies and strategies that made Ice Age survival possible, the ingenious solutions that humans developed to cope with conditions that would kill most other species. And as I do, remember that these were not abstract problems solved by distant strangers. These were your ancestors, your family, people whose blood runs in your veins and whose achievements made your life possible. The first and most important adaptation was clothing. Humans are tropical animals by origin. We evolved in Africa, in warm climates where clothing was optional, where our hairless skin was an advantage for cooling rather than a liability for warmth. When we moved into colder regions, we had to solve the problem of heat loss, and we solved it with clothing that is still impressive by modern standards. Ice Age clothing was not simple. It was not a few animal skins thrown over the shoulders. It was a sophisticated system of layered garments, carefully designed and meticulously constructed to provide maximum insulation with minimum bulk and weight. The people who made this clothing understood the principles of heat retention, as well as any modern engineer, even if they could not have explained those principles in scientific terms. The inner layer was worn with the fur facing inward, against the skin. This created a layer of warm air trapped between the body and the garment, air that was heated by body warmth and held in place by the fur fibers. The fur itself was carefully selected from animals whose coats provided the best insulation. Caribou and reindeer, whose hollow hairs trap air inside each fiber, creating exceptional warmth for their weight. The outer layer was worn with the fur facing outward, to shed snow and resist wind. This layer was often made from different materials than the inner layer, selected for durability and water resistance rather than pure insulation. The two layers together created a clothing system that could maintain body temperature in conditions far colder than anything most modern humans ever experience. But the garments were not just functional, they were also carefully tailored to fit the body, because fit matters for insulation. A loose garment allows warm air to escape and cold air to enter. A tight garment compresses the insulating material and reduces its effectiveness. Ice Age tailors, if we can call them that, understood these principles and created clothing that fit properly, that moved with the body, that allowed work and travel without sacrificing warmth. The key to this tailoring was the bone needle. This tiny tool, just a few inches long, with an eye small enough to thread with sinew, was one of the most important inventions in human history. It allowed the creation of fitted clothing, of seams and hems and closures that kept the cold out and the warmth in. Without the bone needle, humans could not have survived the Ice Age. We would have been limited to warmer climates, unable to exploit the rich resources of the mammoth steppe, unable to become the global species we are today. The needles were made from bone, usually the leg bones of birds or small mammals, which are naturally hollow and can be shaped into slender, strong needles. The eye was created by drilling or scraping a small hole near one end, a process that required patience and skill, but produced a tool that could last for years with proper care. These needles were precious, often carried in special cases made from bone or antler, protected from damage, passed down from generation to generation as valued possessions. The thread was sinew, the tough connective tissue that attaches muscle to bone in large animals. When dried and split into fine strands, sinew makes an excellent thread, strong, flexible, and with a natural tendency to swell slightly when wet, which actually tightens the seams and makes them more waterproof. Ice Age seamstresses, and they were probably mostly women based on ethnographic parallels, learned to prepare sinew properly, to split it to the right thickness, to sew with stitches that held under stress, to create garments that could mean the difference between life and death. The clothing system also included footwear, which was critically important for surviving Ice Age conditions. Cold feet are not just uncomfortable, they are dangerous. Frostbite can set in quickly, leading to tissue damage, infection, and potentially death. Ice Age boots were multi-layered like the rest of the clothing, with inner liners of soft fur and outer shells of tougher material, often waterproofed with animal fat. They were designed for the specific conditions of Ice Age life, for walking on snow and ice, for standing still during long hunting waits, for the constant physical activity that survival required. Mittens protected the hands, which are even more vulnerable to cold than feet, because of their high surface area relative to their mass. Ice Age mittens were often attached to the sleeves of parkas with cords, preventing loss if they were removed for fine work. They could be removed quickly when dexterity was needed and replaced just as quickly when warmth became the priority. Some designs included a slit in the palm that allowed the hand to emerge without removing the entire mitten, a clever solution to the constant trade-off between warmth and function. Hoods were essential for protecting the head and face, which lose heat rapidly due to their high blood flow. Ice Age hoods were often edged with wolf or wolverine fur, which resists frost build-up from breath better than other furs. This was not accidental or decorative. It was a functional choice based on thousands of years of experience, knowledge passed down through generations of people who had learned, sometimes the hard way, which materials worked best for which purposes. All of this clothing required enormous amounts of time and effort to create. Preparing hides was a lengthy process involving scraping, stretching, smoking, and softening. Sewing a single garment could take weeks. Maintaining and repairing clothing was a constant task. A significant portion of Ice Age life was devoted simply to creating and maintaining the tools of survival, the clothing and shelter and equipment that stood between humans and the killing cold. This investment was worthwhile because the alternative was death. Without proper clothing, a human being cannot survive Ice Age conditions for more than a few hours. The cold is simply too intense, too relentless, too effective at draining heat from the body. Clothing was the first line of defense, the portable shelter that went everywhere a person went, the technology that transformed a tropical animal into a creature capable of living in the coldest places on Earth. Let me tell you now about shelter, the other essential defense against the cold. Clothing protected individuals when they were moving, working, hunting, traveling. Shelter protected groups when they were resting, sleeping, recovering their strength for the challenges ahead. Together, clothing and shelter created the thermal environment that humans needed to survive, a zone of warmth in a world of deadly cold. Ice Age shelters took many forms, depending on the materials available and the specific needs of the group. In areas with caves, natural rock shelters provided excellent protection from the elements. Caves maintain a relatively constant temperature year-round, warmer than the outside air in winter and cooler in summer. They block wind completely, which is crucial because wind dramatically increases heat loss through convection. They often have natural features like overhangs that prevent rain and snow from entering, and they require no construction, no investment of time and energy in building, freeing that time and energy for other survival tasks. But caves are not always available, and Ice Age people often lived in areas far from any natural shelter. In these situations, they built structures from whatever materials the environment provided. On the Mammoth Steppe, where trees were scarce but large animals were abundant, they built shelters from mammoth bones. These mammoth bone shelters are among the most remarkable structures of the Ice Age, circular or oval foundations made from mammoth skulls, tusks and leg bones, covered with hides that were probably stretched over a framework of lighter bones or wooden poles. Some of these structures were enormous, over 20 feet in diameter, capable of housing extended families through the long winter months. The bones were not chosen randomly. Mammoth skulls formed the base, their curved shape creating a stable foundation. Tusks were arranged in arches, their natural curve providing a framework for the roof. Leg bones and ribs filled the gaps, creating a continuous wall. The whole structure was covered with hides, probably multiple layers weighted down with more bones to resist the wind. Inside, a central hearth provided heat and light, the smoke escaping through an opening at the top of the dome. These shelters were not temporary camps. Some mammoth bone sites show evidence of repeated occupation over thousands of years, generation after generation returning to the same locations, perhaps because of nearby resources or simply because the bones provided a ready-made foundation for new construction. The amount of labour required to build one of these shelters was enormous, involving the transport of tons of bone from kill sites that might be miles away. But once built, they could last for decades, providing reliable shelter through countless winters, anchoring communities to places that became home. In areas where wood was available, Ice Age people built different types of shelters. Semi-subterranean houses, dug partly into the ground for insulation, were common in some regions. The earth itself provided warmth, maintaining temperatures well above the frigid air outside. These pit houses were covered with frameworks of wood and hides, sometimes with sod piled on top for additional insulation. They were easier to heat than above-ground structures because so much of their surface was in contact with the earth rather than the cold air. Tents of hide over wooden poles were used for more temporary camps, for hunting parties away from the main settlement, for groups moving with the seasonal migrations of game. These tents were the ancestors of the tipis used by later Native American peoples, cone-shaped or dome-shaped structures that could be erected quickly, moved easily, and provided adequate shelter for short stays. They were not as warm as permanent structures, but they were portable, and portability mattered in a world where resources moved and people had to move with them. Inside any Ice Age shelter, fire was the heart of the home. Fire provided warmth, of course, pushing back the cold that would otherwise seep in through every gap and seam, but fire also provided light in the long winter darkness, when the sun might appear for only a few hours each day or not at all. Fire provided a way to cook food, which was essential not just for taste but for safety and nutrition. Fire was the gathering point, the social centre, the place where people came together to eat and talk and share stories, and strengthen the bonds that held communities together. Maintaining fire was critical and constant work. Fire needs fuel, and fuel was often scarce in Ice Age environments. In areas without trees, people burned animal dung, which dried quickly in the cold air and burned hot and clean. They burned bones, which contain enough fat to sustain combustion. They burned anything that would burn, hoarding fuel against the possibility that the fire might go out at a critical moment, that they might find themselves in the cold and dark with no way to restore the warmth. Fire also had to be transported when groups moved. Carrying an ember or a smouldering piece of punk fungus was easier than starting a new fire from scratch, especially in cold, wet conditions where friction fire starting is difficult. The fire carrier was an important role, someone responsible for keeping the ember alive during travel, for protecting it from wind and rain, for delivering it safely to the next camp where it could be blown back into flame. Let me tell you now about food, because all the clothing and shelter in the world cannot save you if you do not have enough calories to survive. The human body burns energy constantly, even at rest, and in cold conditions it burns more energy to maintain body temperature. Ice Age people needed to consume large amounts of food simply to stay alive, and finding that food in a frozen world was one of the greatest challenges they faced. The Mammoth Steppe, that vast grassland of the Ice Age, was dominated by large herbivores. Mammoths, woolly rhinoceroses, bison, horses, reindeer, musk oxen, and many others. These animals represented an enormous reservoir of calories, fat and protein, in quantities that could sustain human communities through the leanest times, but hunting these animals was not easy. They were large and dangerous, capable of killing hunters who made mistakes. They were wary, with keen senses that detected danger and allowed them to flee. They moved with the seasons, following the grass, meaning that hunters had to follow them or go hungry. Ice Age hunting was a sophisticated endeavour, requiring detailed knowledge of animal behaviour, careful planning, and coordinated group action. Hunters had to know where the animals would be at different times of year, how they would react to different threats, what strategies would work and what would fail. They had to communicate effectively, coordinating their actions across distances, signalling silently so as not to alert prey. They had to be patient, sometimes waiting for hours or days for the right opportunity. They had to be brave, facing animals that could kill them with a single blow, trusting in their skills and their companions. The weapons they used were well suited to their purpose. Spears with stone points could bring down large animals if placed correctly, targeting vulnerable areas like the chest or belly, where internal organs could be damaged. Atlatls, or spear throwers, increased the range and power of the spear, allowing hunters to strike from safer distances. Bows and arrows, which appeared during the later Ice Age in some regions, provided even greater range and accuracy, though they were less effective against very large animals. The hunt itself took many forms. Sometimes hunters stalked individual animals, approaching carefully using terrain and wind direction for concealment. Sometimes they drove herds toward natural traps, cliffs where animals would fall to their deaths, narrow valleys where they could be cornered, soft ground where they would become mired. Sometimes they used fire to direct animal movement, burning grasslands strategically to funnel herds toward waiting hunters. Sometimes they simply waited at water sources or migration routes, knowing that prey would eventually come to them. When a large animal was killed, the work was just beginning. Butchering a mammoth or a bison is an enormous task, requiring hours or days of effort. Every usable part of the animal had to be processed. Meat cut into pieces that could be transported, fat rendered for storage, organs saved for immediate consumption, hides prepared for later use, bones collected for tools and fuel and building material. Nothing was wasted. The animals that died to feed Ice Age communities were used completely, every scrap of value extracted from their bodies. Food storage was essential because hunting success was unpredictable. A successful hunt might provide more meat than a group could eat before it spoiled. A failed hunt might leave the group hungry for days or weeks. The solution was storage, ways of preserving food against future need. In the Ice Age, this often meant freezing, which was easy enough when the outside temperature was well below freezing for most of the year. Meat could be cached in pits dug into the frozen ground, natural freezers that kept food fresh for months. It could be hung in trees, out of reach of scavenging animals but accessible to humans. It could be dried or smoked, processes that preserved food even when temperatures rose above freezing. The fat from large animals was particularly precious. Fat contains more than twice as many calories per gram as protein or carbohydrate, making it the most efficient form of food storage. Ice Age people ate more fat than we would consider healthy today, but their activity levels and thermal demands made this appropriate. They needed the concentrated energy that fat provided, the dense calories that could sustain intense physical activity in extreme cold. Without adequate fat in the diet, survival in Ice Age conditions would have been impossible. Hunting large animals was not the only source of food. Small game provided an important supplement. Rabbits and hares, birds and their eggs, fish from rivers and lakes that remained ice-free or could be fished through the ice. These smaller animals were easier to catch than mammoths or bison, though they provided less food per animal. A hunter might spend all day catching rabbits and return with less food than a successful mammoth hunt would provide in a single kill. But rabbit hunts were more reliable, less dangerous, and the accumulated catches added up over time. Plants were also part of the Ice Age diet, though they were less important than in warmer climates. The growing season was short, and many familiar plant foods were simply unavailable in Ice Age environments. But Ice Age people did gather what they could: berries and roots, nuts and seeds, the inner bark of certain trees that provided starch in lean times. They knew their environments intimately, knew where to find every edible species, knew when to harvest for maximum nutrition. This knowledge was essential, supplementing the hunting economy with vegetable foods that provided vitamins and variety. Let me tell you now about the social structures that made Ice Age survival possible, because no individual could survive alone in these conditions. The challenges were too great, the margin for error too small, the demands of survival too continuous. Only groups could survive, communities of people working together, sharing resources, dividing labour, supporting each other through the hardships that the Ice Age imposed. The basic unit of Ice Age society was probably the band, a group of perhaps 25 to 50 people related by blood or marriage. This is the size of social group that humans seem naturally suited for, large enough to provide security and diverse skills, but small enough for everyone to know everyone else personally. Bands lived together, travelled together, shared food and shelter and the work of survival. They were the primary unit of social identity, the group with which individuals identified most strongly. Within the band, labour was divided by age and sex. Men probably did most of the hunting of large animals, a dangerous activity requiring strength and speed and the ability to be away from camp for extended periods. Women probably did most of the gathering and processing of food, the making and repair of clothing, the care of children who could not yet contribute to their own survival. Elders contributed their knowledge and experience, teaching younger people the skills they would need, providing guidance and continuity across generations. Children learned by watching and doing, gradually taking on more responsibility as they grew. This division of labour was not absolute or rigid. When circumstances required it, anyone might do any task, but the general pattern allowed for specialisation, for the development of expertise that made the whole group more effective than any collection of individuals could be. A hunter who spent most of his time hunting became better at hunting than someone who divided attention among many tasks. A seamstress who spent most of her time sewing became more skilled than someone who sewed only occasionally. Specialisation increased efficiency, and efficiency was essential when survival margins were thin. Bands were connected to other bands through networks of kinship, trade, and alliance. No band was completely isolated. People married out, moving to join the bands of their spouses, creating ties between groups that might live hundreds of miles apart. Trade goods moved along these networks, raw materials not available locally, finished products of particular quality, information about resources and conditions in distant areas. The networks provided insurance against local disaster, because a band that suffered a catastrophic loss could turn to allies for help, could move into other territories until conditions improved, could receive food and shelter from relatives who would expect the same help if their positions were reversed. The social networks also provided genetic diversity, preventing the inbreeding that would otherwise result from small, isolated populations. People knew who was related to whom, at least within a broad region, and marriage rules encouraged unions between people from different bands. This kept the gene pool healthy, prevented the accumulation of harmful mutations, maintained the biological diversity that is the foundation of evolutionary success. Let me tell you about the children of the Ice Age, because every society depends on its children for continuity, and Ice Age societies were no exception. Children were precious, the future of the band, the carriers of all the knowledge and tradition that had been accumulated over countless generations. But children were also vulnerable, requiring years of care before they could contribute to their own survival, representing a significant investment of resources at a time when resources were scarce. Infant mortality was probably high by modern standards. Cold, disease, accidents, and food shortages all took their toll. But the children who survived infancy were the lucky ones, and they were raised with care and attention, taught everything they needed to know to survive in the harsh world they would inherit. Education was not formal, not separated from daily life. Children learned by watching adults, by helping with tasks appropriate to their age, by listening to stories and songs that encoded practical knowledge in memorable forms. A child growing up in an Ice Age band would learn to identify animal tracks and plant species, to make and repair tools, to find shelter in emergencies, to work effectively as part of a group. By adolescence, they would be contributing members of the community, and by adulthood, they would be ready to take their place in the endless work of survival. The transition to adulthood was probably marked by ceremonies and rituals, moments of social recognition that acknowledged new status and new responsibilities. For young men, this might involve a first successful hunt or some other demonstration of competence. For young women, it might involve puberty rituals or the assumption of adult work roles. These transitions mattered because they defined expectations, clarified social roles, and reinforced the values that held the community together. Play was part of childhood even in the Ice Age. Children played with miniature tools and weapons, practicing the skills they would need as adults. They played social games, learning to cooperate and compete, to negotiate and compromise. They explored their environments, developing the intimate knowledge of local landscape that would serve them throughout their lives. Play was not frivolous. It was essential preparation for the serious business of survival. Now let me tell you about the spiritual and emotional lives of Ice Age people, because humans have never survived by physical means alone. We need meaning and purpose, connection and hope, ways of understanding our place in the universe that make the struggle of existence worthwhile. Ice Age people were no different. They had rich inner lives, beliefs and practices that sustained them through hardships, art and ritual that expressed their understanding of the world and their place in it. The cave paintings of Ice Age Europe are perhaps the most famous artifacts of this period, and they speak to a world of symbolic thought and artistic expression that was highly developed tens of thousands of years ago. The painted caves of France and Spain contain thousands of images, mostly of animals but also including human figures, geometric patterns, and symbols whose meaning we can only guess at. These paintings were not casual doodles. They were major undertakings, created deep in caves that required effort and courage to reach, painted by artists working by torchlight in darkness far from the sun. Why did Ice Age people paint these images? We cannot know for certain. They may have been religious or magical, attempts to influence hunting success or communicate with spiritual forces. They may have been educational, teaching young hunters about the animals they would encounter. They may have been records, marking important events or encoding information about resources. They may have been expressions of artistic impulse, created for the same reasons that humans have always created art: to express, to communicate, to make beauty, to leave something of ourselves behind. Whatever their specific purpose, the cave paintings tell us that Ice Age people had rich symbolic lives, that they thought about the world in abstract terms, that they communicated through images as well as words. They made art because they were human, because humans have always made art, because there is something in our nature that compels us to represent our experience, to transform raw existence into meaningful form. The paintings also tell us that Ice Age people valued certain things. Animals dominate the imagery, especially the large animals that were so important for survival. Horses, bison, mammoths, reindeer. These were not just food sources. They were central to Ice Age culture, represented again and again in art and ornament, presumably important in stories and beliefs and rituals that have not survived. The relationship between humans and these animals was complex, involving not just predation but also respect, even reverence for the creatures that made human life possible. Music and dance were probably part of Ice Age life as well, though the evidence is harder to find. Bone flutes have been discovered at some Ice Age sites, simple instruments capable of producing melodic sounds. Where there are instruments, there is probably music, and where there is music, there is probably dance. These arts may have been purely recreational, ways of passing time during the long winter nights. They may have been ritual, part of ceremonies that marked important occasions or invoked spiritual powers. They may have been both, or neither, or something we cannot easily categorize with our modern concepts. Burial practices provide another window into Ice Age beliefs. Ice Age people buried their dead with care, sometimes with grave goods that suggest belief in some form of afterlife. Bodies were sometimes covered with red ochre, a pigment that may have had symbolic significance. They were sometimes buried with tools or ornaments, items that might be needed in another world, or that expressed the identity and status of the deceased. These burial practices suggest that Ice Age people thought about death, wondered what happened after life ended, developed beliefs and rituals to address the mysteries of mortality. This is not surprising. All humans think about death. All humans develop ways of coping with its reality, of giving meaning to the transition from existence to whatever lies beyond. Ice Age people were no different. They faced death constantly, lived with it as a daily reality, and developed cultural responses that helped them bear its weight. Let me tell you now about the climate itself, about the rhythms and variations of the Ice Age that shaped human experience throughout this period. The Ice Age was not a single uniform event. It was a complex period with its own patterns and fluctuations, times of greater cold and times of relative warmth, moments of crisis and moments of opportunity. Understanding these patterns helps us understand how humans adapted, how they coped with changing conditions, how they survived through variations that could shift circumstances dramatically within a single lifetime. The coldest time was the last glacial maximum, around 26,000 to 19,000 years ago. This was when the ice sheets reached their greatest extent, when sea levels dropped to their lowest point, when the Mammoth Steppe stretched unbroken from Western Europe to Alaska. During this period, human populations probably declined, retreating to refugia where conditions were more tolerable, abandoning vast territories that had once supported thriving communities. In Europe, humans retreated to southern refugia in Iberia, Italy, and the Balkans, areas where the climate remained relatively mild even at the height of the cold. The northern two-thirds of the continent was largely abandoned, too harsh even for Ice Age adapted people with all their sophisticated technology. Populations that had spread north during earlier warm periods pulled back, concentrating in smaller areas, probably suffering significant population losses in the process, but they survived. The refugia supported enough people to maintain viable populations, to preserve the knowledge and traditions that had been developed over millennia, to provide the foundation for recolonization when conditions improved. The survivors carried with them the genetic heritage of earlier populations and the cultural heritage of Ice Age adaptation. They were the bridge between the world before the glacial maximum and the world after. After the glacial maximum, conditions began to improve, though the improvement was not linear or consistent. There were setbacks, periods when the cold returned temporarily, times when it seemed like the Ice Age might never end. The Younger Dryas, about 12,800 to 11,500 years ago, was one such setback, a sudden return to near-glacial conditions that lasted over 1,000 years. This cold snap occurred just as the world seemed to be warming, a cruel reminder that climate does not change smoothly or predictably, that progress can be reversed, that survival requires constant vigilance and adaptation. The Younger Dryas probably caused significant hardship for human populations that had begun to expand into newly temperate territories. Some populations may have retreated again, abandoning lands they had only recently recolonized. Others may have adapted in place, developing new strategies to cope with conditions that had suddenly become more challenging. The mammoths and other Ice Age megafauna which had survived the glacial maximum finally went extinct during or shortly after the Younger Dryas, possibly driven over the edge by the combination of climate stress and human hunting pressure. When the Younger Dryas ended, the Ice Age truly came to a close. Temperatures rose rapidly, ice sheets melted, forests spread into regions that had been tundra or steppe for thousands of years. The world transformed from the Ice Age environment to something much closer to what we know today. This transformation was dramatic and rapid by geological standards, occurring over just a few thousand years. It was the end of an era, the close of a chapter of human history that had lasted 100,000 years. The humans who emerged from the Ice Age were changed by their experience. They carried adaptations, biological and cultural, that reflected their ancestors' struggle to survive the cold. They had technologies and social structures that had been refined over millennia of Ice Age living. They had art and beliefs and traditions that bore the mark of their Ice Age origins. And they had numbers again, populations rebounding from the low point of the glacial maximum, ready to spread into the newly temperate world and eventually become the billions of humans alive today. You are one of those humans. You are a descendant of Ice Age survivors, an inheritor of all the adaptations and innovations that made their survival possible. The warmth you feel in your bed tonight is possible because your ancestors learned to create warmth in a frozen world. The food you ate today reached you through agricultural systems that ultimately descend from the foraging strategies of Ice Age hunters and gatherers. The social structures you live within, the families and communities and nations, have roots that stretch back to the bands and networks of Ice Age people cooperating to survive impossible conditions. The Ice Age is not just ancient history. It is your history. It is the crucible that forged the humanity you inherit, the challenge that shaped the species you belong to, the test that your ancestors passed so that you could exist tonight. Let me tell you now about specific places and peoples, about the different ways that Ice Age humans adapted to the different environments they inhabited. Because the Ice Age world was not uniform. Conditions varied enormously from place to place, and human adaptations varied in response. The people who survived in Ice Age Europe faced different challenges than those who survived in Ice Age Africa or Ice Age Asia, and they developed different solutions that reflected their particular circumstances. In southwestern France, the area around the Dordogne Valley became one of the great centres of Ice Age human culture. This region combined several advantages: a relatively mild climate moderated by the Atlantic Ocean, numerous caves and rock shelters providing natural protection, abundant game including reindeer that migrated through the area in enormous numbers each year. The people who lived here developed some of the most sophisticated Ice Age cultures known to archaeology, leaving behind cave paintings, carved figurines, elaborate tools, and evidence of complex social organization. The caves of the Dordogne, places with names like Lascaux and Fontegaume and Les Combarelles, contain some of the most remarkable art in human history. The painted halls of Lascaux, discovered by teenagers in 1940, depict hundreds of animals in a style that combines naturalistic observation with artistic stylization. Horses and bulls, deer and bison, even a mysterious beast that may be a mythological creature, parade across the cave walls in compositions that demonstrate sophisticated understanding of form and movement. These paintings were created around 17,000 years ago, at a time when much of Europe was still locked in ice, and they speak to a culture that had time and energy for art, that valued beauty and meaning, that was thriving despite the challenges of Ice Age existence. In Central Europe, conditions were harsher and human populations were sparser. The ice sheets advanced further south here, squeezing habitable territory into a narrow band between the glaciers and the Mediterranean. The people who lived here were more mobile, following game across open landscapes, leaving fewer permanent sites and less elaborate art. But they survived, maintaining populations that would eventually recolonize the north when conditions improved. Sites like Dolní Věstonice in the Czech Republic show what life was like in these challenging environments. Mammoth bone shelters, elaborate burials, evidence of specialized crafts including some of the oldest known ceramics in the world. In Eastern Europe and Siberia, the mammoth steppe stretched endlessly, supporting huge herds of grazing animals and the human hunters who depended on them. This was perhaps the most productive Ice Age environment, with more biomass per unit area than any other ecosystem of the time. The people who lived here were mammoth hunters, par excellence, building their shelters from mammoth bones, burning mammoth bones for fuel, exploiting every part of these enormous animals for food and material. They followed the herds across vast distances, developing nomadic lifestyles adapted to the rhythms of animal migration. Some of them eventually walked across the Bering Land Bridge into the Americas, carrying their Ice Age adaptations into a new world. In Africa, conditions during the Ice Age were different but still challenging. The climate was colder and drier, which in Africa meant the expansion of deserts and the contraction of forests. The Sahara, which had sometimes been green during previous warm periods, expanded dramatically, creating a barrier between northern and sub-Saharan Africa. Human populations adapted by concentrating near water sources, by developing new tools for hunting in open environments, by maintaining the mobility that had always been part of African human life. Africa was the original human homeland, and it remained inhabited throughout the Ice Age, providing a reservoir of human population that contributed to post-Ice Age expansion. In Asia, the Ice Age brought transformations that shaped human history for millennia. The drop in sea levels exposed vast areas of continental shelf, connecting islands that are now separated by water. Japan was connected to mainland Asia. Indonesia was a single landmass called Sundaland. Australia and New Guinea formed a combined continent called Sahul. These land connections allowed human movement across territories that are now underwater, spreading populations and cultures across island chains that would become isolated again when sea levels rose. The people who lived in Ice Age Asia developed diverse adaptations to diverse environments, from the tropical forests of the south to the frozen steppes of the north, laying the foundations for the cultural diversity that would characterize Asia in later periods. In the Americas, humans arrived during the Ice Age and spread rapidly through two vast continents. The first Americans were Ice Age people, adapted to cold climates, equipped with technologies developed over millennia of Ice Age survival. They found a world full of large animals that had never encountered human hunters, animals that did not know to fear them, animals that could be hunted more easily than the wary, experienced game of the Old World. This abundance may have enabled rapid population growth and spread, as the first Americans exploited resources that seemed almost unlimited, at least at first. Within a few thousand years of arrival, humans had reached every corner of both American continents, from the Arctic to Tierra del Fuego, developing distinct cultures adapted to every imaginable environment. Let me tell you now about the end of the Ice Age and what it meant for the people who had survived it. The warming began around 20,000 years ago, slowly at first, with periods of reversal and stagnation. But the trend was unmistakable. The ice was retreating, the world was changing, and humans had to change with it. For people adapted to Ice Age conditions, the warming was not an unmixed blessing. The environments they knew, the resources they depended on, the skills they had developed over millennia, all became less relevant as the world transformed around them. The mammoth steppe, that great grassland ecosystem, began to fragment and disappear as forests spread northward. The large animals that had dominated Ice Age landscapes, the mammoths and woolly rhinoceroses and giant deer, began to decline. pushed toward extinction by a combination of climate change and human hunting pressure. The world that had tested human survival for so long was disappearing, replaced by something new and different. The human response was adaptation, as it had always been. People developed new tools for hunting smaller, faster game in forested environments. They developed new ways of exploiting plant resources that became more abundant as the climate warmed. They developed new social structures suited to new conditions, abandoning some Ice Age patterns and creating new ones. They spread into territories that had been uninhabitable during the glacial maximum, recolonizing northern Europe and Siberia, establishing populations in lands that had been covered by ice just a few thousand years before. And eventually, in some places, they developed agriculture. This was the most momentous change of all, the shift from hunting and gathering to farming that would transform human society and ultimately create the world we live in today. Agriculture appeared first in the Near East, around 12,000 years ago, as the Ice Age was ending and the climate was stabilizing into something like its current form. It spread from there to Europe, to Africa, to South and East Asia, wherever conditions permitted and populations adopted it. Agriculture allowed larger populations, settled communities, complex societies, cities and states and civilizations. It was the foundation of everything that came after, the platform on which human history as we usually understand it was built. The Ice Age people who survived to see the dawn of agriculture were the bridge between two worlds. They carried Ice Age adaptations and Ice Age traditions into a new era, contributing their genetic heritage and their cultural knowledge to the populations that would create settled civilizations. Their descendants forgot the Ice Age, lost touch with the experiences that had shaped their ancestors, developed new identities and new traditions suited to new conditions. But the Ice Age was still there, hidden in their genes, encoded in aspects of their cultures they did not fully understand, waiting to be rediscovered by archaeologists and scientists who would piece together the story thousands of years later. You are one of those descendants. The Ice Age runs through your ancestry, whether you know the specific details or not. Every person alive today descends from Ice Age survivors, carries Ice Age adaptations in their genes, inherits Ice Age traditions in some form, however transformed by the intervening millennia. The warmth you enjoy, the security you feel, the abundance that surrounds you, all of these exist because your ancestors survived conditions that would seem impossible to most people today. They survived because they were smart, resourceful, cooperative, and determined. They survived because they refused to give up, because they kept solving problems, because they supported each other through hardships that tested every aspect of their humanity. They survived because that is what humans do. We survive. We adapt. We find ways through challenges that seem insurmountable. We are still here, 12,000 years after the Ice Age ended, 8 billion strong and still growing, still spreading, still adapting to whatever the world throws at us. The Ice Age was not the first challenge humans faced, and it will not be the last. The world continues to change, sometimes slowly and sometimes quickly, sometimes in ways we can predict and sometimes in ways that surprise us. Climate change is happening again today, driven this time by human activity rather than orbital variations. Other challenges loom on the horizon, challenges that will test human resilience and cooperation, just as the Ice Age tested our ancestors. We will face those challenges as our ancestors faced theirs, with intelligence, with technology, with social cooperation, with the stubborn determination that defines our species. We will adapt as we have always adapted. We will survive as we have always survived. And thousands of years from now, our descendants will look back at us as we look back at our Ice Age ancestors, wondering at the challenges we faced, admiring the solutions we developed, grateful that we succeeded so they could exist. The fire burns low now. The long story of the Ice Age has been told from its beginning over 100,000 years ago to its end 12,000 years ago, from the challenges it posed to the adaptations humans developed, from the specific experiences of different peoples in different places to the universal themes of survival and resilience that connect all Ice Age stories. You have walked with your ancestors through the frozen world, felt something of what they felt, understood something of what they achieved. Now it is time to rest. The Ice Age is over. The cold has retreated. The world is warm, at least for now, and you are safe in your bed, inheritor of all the strength and wisdom and determination that carried your ancestors through the hardest times in human history. They survived so you could be here. Honor them with your rest. Honor them by being alive, by being human, by carrying forward the heritage they left you. The morning will come, as mornings always do. The world will present its challenges as the world always does, and you will face them with the resilience of your ancestors, the descendants of those who survived the Ice Age, the children of the cold who became the masters of the warm world that followed. Sleep now. Dream of ice and fire, of mammoth herds and cave paintings, of bone needles and fur clothing and the endless work of survival. Dream of your ancestors, those distant relatives who lived and died so that you could live, who faced challenges beyond imagining and refused to be defeated. Dream and wake knowing that their strength is your strength, their story is your story, their survival is your existence. The Ice Age is part of you. It always has been. It always will be. And now, having honoured it with attention and memory, you can let it rest in your bones while you rest in your bed, safe and warm, ready for whatever tomorrow brings. Good night, child of the Ice Age. Sleep well, descendant of survivors. The cold cannot reach you now. The warmth surrounds you. The night holds you gently, as nights have held your ancestors for 100,000 generations, through ice ages and warm periods, through challenges and triumphs, through all the long story of human existence on this beautiful, difficult, remarkable planet. Sleep, dream, rest, and wake ready to continue the story your ancestors began so long ago, in a world of ice that they transformed through sheer human determination into the world of warmth and possibility you inherit tonight. Good night. Let me continue with more of the story, because the night is long, and there is more to tell about the Ice Age and the people who survived it. Let me tell you about the specific technologies in more detail, about the daily rhythms of Ice Age life, about the moments of joy and sorrow that punctuated existence in a frozen world. These details matter because they bring the Ice Age to life, transform it from an abstraction to a lived experience, connect you more deeply to the ancestors whose story this is. Consider the making of a single bone needle, that tiny tool that made Ice Age survival possible. The process began with the selection of the right bone, usually the leg bone of a bird or small mammal, hollow and strong and of the right diameter for the finished needle. The bone was cleaned of any remaining tissue, dried, examined for cracks or weaknesses that might cause it to break during use. Only the best bones were suitable for needles. The rest was saved for other purposes or discarded. Once a suitable bone was selected, the craftsperson began the long process of shaping. Stone tools scraped away material, thinning the bone, smoothing its surface, creating the slender shaft that would become the needle body. This work required patience and skill. Too much pressure would break the bone. Too little would leave the surface rough and uneven. The craftsperson worked slowly, removing material a little at a time, checking progress frequently, adjusting technique as needed. The point was shaped next, ground against an abrasive stone until it was sharp enough to pierce hide easily. A dull point would make sewing difficult and would damage the material being sewn. A point too sharp might be fragile, prone to breaking under the stresses of use. The ideal point was sharp enough to penetrate easily, but strong enough to withstand repeated use. Finding this balance required experience, a feel for the material that came only from years of practice. The eye was the most challenging part. Creating a hole in bone small enough for sinew thread but large enough to be practical, without breaking the surrounding material, required careful work. Some craftspeople drilled the hole using a small stone bit rotated between the palms. Others scraped or picked at the bone until a hole formed. The method varied, but the goal was the same. A smooth, round eye that would accept thread without cutting it, that would not snag or tear the sinew during sewing. A finished needle might be only 2 or 3 inches long, weighing almost nothing, easily lost or broken. Yet it represented hours of work, specialized knowledge, materials that might be scarce, and irreplaceable function. Without needles, there would be no fitted clothing. Without fitted clothing, there would be no survival in Ice Age conditions. The bone needle was the foundation of Ice Age technology, the essential tool that made all other adaptations possible. Needles were precious possessions, cared for carefully, stored in protective cases, repaired when possible, mourned when lost or broken. A person might use the same needle for years, developing a relationship with the tool that modern people might find hard to understand. The needle knew the hand that held it, fit the grip of its owner, performed according to patterns of use that became unconscious with practice. Losing a needle was losing part of oneself, losing months or years of accumulated adaptation between tool and user. The sinew thread that accompanied the needle was equally important and equally demanding to prepare. Sinew is the connective tissue that attaches muscle to bone. Tough and fibrous when fresh, remarkably strong and flexible when properly prepared. Ice Age people harvested sinew from the legs and backs of large animals, stripping it away during butchering, saving it for later processing. Fresh sinew had to be cleaned of any remaining meat or fat, then dried until it became stiff and brittle. In this state, it could be stored indefinitely, waiting until it was needed for sewing or cordage. When needed, the dried sinew was pounded or chewed to separate the individual fibres, then split into strands of appropriate thickness for the task at hand. Fine sewing required fine thread. Heavy work like attaching soles to boots required thicker strands. The craftsperson selected and prepared thread to match each specific need. One remarkable property of sinew is that it swells slightly when wet. This meant that seams sewn with sinew actually tightened when they got damp, becoming more waterproof rather than less. Ice Age seamstresses understood this property, even if they could not have explained it scientifically. They used it to their advantage, creating clothing that performed better in the wet conditions that sometimes occurred even in Ice Age environments. Now let me tell you about a day in the life of an Ice Age family. Not a day of crisis or drama, but an ordinary day. The kind of day that made up most of Ice Age existence. Understanding these ordinary days helps us understand how Ice Age life actually worked, how people managed the endless demands of survival while still finding time for rest and relationship and meaning. Dawn comes late in the Ice Age winter. The sun appears briefly above the southern horizon, casting long shadows across the snow, providing a few hours of pale light before sinking again into the long night. The family stirs in their shelter, a structure of mammoth bones and hides that has housed them through many winters. The fire has burned low during the night but still glows with embers that can be coaxed back to flame. The first task of the day is rebuilding the fire. Someone adds fuel, dried dung or bones saved from yesterday's cooking, and blows gently on the embers until flames appear. The fire is essential, not just for warmth but for light in the dark shelter, for cooking food, for the psychological comfort of flame in a frozen world. Throughout the day, someone will tend the fire, ensuring it does not go out, adding fuel as needed, maintaining the heart of the home. Breakfast is simple: dried meat from a successful hunt weeks ago, perhaps some fat to provide concentrated energy for the day's activities. There is no cooking this morning, no elaborate preparation. Food is fuel, consumed quickly so that the day's work can begin. There will be time for a larger meal later, when the day's tasks are complete and the family gathers around the fire for the evening. The adults assess the day's priorities. Food supplies are adequate for now, but will need replenishment eventually. A hunting party should go out today or tomorrow, scouting for game, checking the traps set yesterday, maintaining the surveillance of the territory that keeps the band fed. Clothing needs attention. One of the children has outgrown a parka, and another garment has developed a tear that needs repair. Tools need maintenance. Several stone scrapers have become dull and need resharpening. The list of tasks is endless, but priorities must be set. Not everything can be done today. The most urgent needs come first. The men prepare for a hunting expedition. They dress carefully, checking each layer of clothing for damage, ensuring that the layering system will function properly in the cold. They gather weapons, spears with stone points, atlatl throwers for increased range, knives for butchering any game they might kill. They pack minimal supplies, a small amount of food, fire-making materials in case they need to spend a night away from camp, cordage and bindings that might be useful for various purposes. The women stay in camp today, though their work is no less important. One begins the repairs on the torn garment, examining the damage, planning the repair, preparing thread and selecting a needle of appropriate size. Another continues work on the new parka for the growing child, cutting and fitting pieces of hide, sewing the complex seams that will create a finished garment. A third processes food for storage, cutting meat into thin strips for drying, rendering fat to be stored in containers made from animal bladders. The children help where they can. Even young children have tasks appropriate to their abilities, gathering fuel, fetching water from the stream that runs near camp, watching younger siblings, learning by observation the skills they will need as adults. Education is constant but informal, woven into the fabric of daily life. No one sits the children down for lessons. They learn by doing, by watching, by asking questions and receiving answers, by absorbing the culture of their people through endless small interactions. The hunters return in the late afternoon, as the brief daylight fades and the long night begins again. Today they had moderate success. 2 rabbits caught in snares, a good-sized fish speared through a hole chopped in the ice of a frozen pond. Not a major kill, but enough to supplement the stored food, enough to justify the effort of the expedition, enough to provide fresh meat for the evening meal. The evening is the social time, the period when the whole band gathers around the central fire, sharing food, sharing stories, strengthening the bonds that hold the community together. The rabbits are butchered and roasted, their small carcasses providing delicious fresh meat after days of dried provisions. The fish is cooked on hot stones, its flesh flaky and rich. Everyone eats, even the youngest children, even the oldest elders, sharing the fruits of the day's work according to need rather than contribution. After eating, the band settles into the quiet activities of evening. Someone brings out a bone flute and plays a simple melody, the high notes piercing in the cold air. Others listen, or talk quietly, or work on tasks that can be done by firelight. The children gradually fall asleep, exhausted by their day's activities, warm in their furs near the fire. The adults stay up later, maintaining the fire, keeping watch against predators attracted by the smell of cooking, enjoying the peace of the evening after the work of the day. Eventually everyone sleeps. The fire burns low but does not go out entirely. Someone will wake periodically through the night to add fuel, to maintain the flame that must not be allowed to die. Outside the shelter, the Ice Age world continues, wind blowing snow across the frozen landscape, predators hunting in the darkness, stars wheeling overhead in their eternal patterns. Inside, the family sleeps, safe for now, warm enough, fed enough, alive for another day in a world that constantly tests their will to survive. This was life in the Ice Age. Not constant crisis, but not easy either. Not drama every day, but not complacency ever. The balance between security and danger, between sufficiency and scarcity, between life and death, was always present, always felt, never forgotten. Every meal was a small victory. Every night survived was a small triumph. Every child who grew to adulthood was a miracle, a continuation of the human story against all the odds that the Ice Age presented. Let me tell you now about the art of the Ice Age in more detail, because art tells us about the inner lives of people we can never meet, reveals the thoughts and feelings that physical artifacts alone cannot express. The Ice Age people who left art behind were not primitive or simple. They were sophisticated artists working within traditions that had developed over thousands of years, creating images that still move us today, tens of thousands of years after they were made. The cave paintings are the most famous, but they were not the only form of Ice Age art. Portable art was probably more common, small carvings and engravings that could be carried from place to place, personal possessions that expressed identity and status, objects that meant something to their owners, even if we cannot know exactly what they meant. The Venus figurines are among the most recognizable portable art objects of the Ice Age. These small carvings, typically depicting female figures with exaggerated breasts, hips and bellies, have been found across Europe, from France to Russia, spanning thousands of years of Ice Age culture. They are remarkably consistent in their basic form despite the vast distances and long time spans involved, suggesting that they represented something important that transcended local variations. What did the Venus figurines mean to the people who made and used them? Scholars have proposed many interpretations. They may have been fertility symbols, invocations of reproductive power in societies where population survival was always uncertain. They may have been goddess images, representations of divine feminine forces that governed aspects of Ice Age cosmology. They may have been self-portraits, women depicting their own bodies in forms that emphasized pregnancy and nourishment. They may have been pornography, erotic images created for male pleasure. They may have been none of these, or all of them, or something we cannot even imagine from our distant vantage point. What we know for certain is that the Venus figurines mattered to Ice Age people. They invested significant time and skill in creating them. They kept them, carried them, passed them on. They made them again and again, generation after generation, maintaining a tradition that persisted for 20,000 years or more. Whatever the figurines meant, they meant something important, something worth the effort of creation and preservation. Other portable art objects include carved animals, often the same species depicted in cave paintings: horses, mammoths, bison, deer. These carvings show detailed observation of animal anatomy and behavior, suggesting that Ice Age artists spent considerable time watching the animals they depicted, learning their forms, understanding their movements. Some carvings are remarkably realistic, capturing the essence of the animal in miniature. Others are more stylized, reducing the animal to essential features that identify the species without attempting photographic accuracy. Personal ornaments were another form of Ice Age art. Beads made from shell, bone, ivory, and stone have been found at many Ice Age sites, sometimes in quantities suggesting that they were sewn onto clothing or strung into necklaces and bracelets. These ornaments required considerable effort to make. Each bead had to be shaped, drilled, smoothed, strung. A single necklace might represent days of work, yet people made them, wore them, buried their dead with them. Ornament mattered in the Ice Age, as it matters in every human society we know of. The cave paintings themselves were not isolated artistic expressions, but parts of larger decorated environments. Some caves were painted over many thousands of years, with different artists adding to existing compositions, creating palimpsests of images that accumulated across generations. The caves were not ordinary living spaces. Most show little evidence of habitation in the painted areas. They were special places, set apart from daily life, visited for purposes that we can only guess at. The journey into some painted caves was itself a significant undertaking. Some paintings are located deep underground, in chambers that could only be reached by crawling through narrow passages, wading through underground rivers, navigating in absolute darkness lit only by primitive torches or fat lamps. The difficulty of access suggests that reaching the paintings was part of their significance, that the journey was as meaningful as the destination, that the paintings were not meant to be seen casually or easily. The paintings themselves show a range of techniques and styles. Some are simple outlines, quickly sketched. Others are elaborate compositions with multiple layers of paint, careful shading, sophisticated use of the natural contours of the rock surface. Some painters used only one colour, others used multiple pigments, creating polychrome images that still glow with colour after tens of thousands of years. The pigments were made from natural materials, ochre for reds and yellows, manganese for black, white clay for white. These materials had to be collected, ground, mixed with binders, prepared for application. The paint was applied with fingers, with brushes made from plant fibres or animal hair, with pads of fur or leather, by blowing through tubes to create spray effects. The techniques varied, but the intent was constant, to create images that would last, that would convey meaning, that would transform the cave walls into something more than mere stone. The subjects of cave paintings are predominantly animals, with certain species appearing again and again across different caves and different time periods. Horses are the most commonly depicted animal, followed by bison, aurochs, mammoths, deer, and ibex. Some species that were certainly known to Ice Age people are rarely or never depicted. Reindeer, for example, which were extremely important for food, are almost absent from cave art. This suggests that the paintings were not simple inventories of known animals, but selective representations governed by rules we do not fully understand. Human figures appear occasionally but are far less common than animal images. When humans are depicted, they are often schematic or incomplete, lacking the detailed naturalism that characterizes the animal images. This contrast is striking and has been much discussed by scholars. Did Ice Age artists consider it inappropriate to depict humans realistically? Did they have different conventions for human and animal representation? Were the occasional human figures added by different artists working in different traditions? We do not know. Abstract signs and symbols also appear in cave art, geometric shapes that seem to have meant something, but whose meaning is now lost. Dots, lines, grids, checkerboards, and more complex shapes appear in many caves, sometimes in isolation, and sometimes in association with animal images. Some researchers believe these signs formed a rudimentary system of notation, a kind of proto-writing that communicated information across time and space. Others are more skeptical, noting that the signs vary considerably from region to region and time to time, lacking the consistency that a true notation system would require. Whatever the specific meanings of Ice Age art, its existence tells us something profound about the people who created it. They had time for art, which means they had achieved at least some margin of security beyond mere survival. They had cultural traditions that spanned generations, transmitting artistic techniques and conventions from teachers to students across thousands of years. They had symbolic thought, the ability to create images that represented things beyond themselves, that carried meanings beyond their physical form. They were, in every way we can measure, fully human, as capable of artistic expression as any people who have lived since. Let me tell you now about the social lives of Ice Age people in more detail, because survival was a collective achievement, not an individual one, and understanding Ice Age society helps us understand how survival was possible. Humans are social animals. We evolved to live in groups, to cooperate with each other, to divide labour and share resources and support each other through difficulties. This social nature was essential in the Ice Age, when the challenges of survival exceeded what any individual could manage alone. The band was the basic social unit, as I mentioned earlier, a group of perhaps 25 to 50 people, connected by kinship and living together in a shared territory. The band was small enough that everyone knew everyone else personally, that social relations could be managed through direct interaction rather than formal rules and institutions. It was large enough to provide the labour pool necessary for Ice Age survival, to include enough hunters and gatherers and craftspeople to keep the group fed and clothed and sheltered. Within the band, relationships were complex and multifaceted. People were simultaneously relatives and neighbours, co-workers and friends, teachers and students, leaders and followers. The same person might be a hunting partner in one context, a competitor for status in another, a confidant in a third. Managing these multiple relationships required social intelligence, the ability to navigate complex webs of obligation and expectation, to balance individual desires against group needs, to maintain harmony in close quarters where conflict could not easily be avoided. Leadership in Ice Age bands was probably informal and situational. Different individuals might lead in different contexts, depending on their particular skills and knowledge. A skilled hunter might lead hunting expeditions. A knowledgeable elder might lead decisions about when to move camp. A respected woman might lead in matters of domestic organisation or conflict resolution. There was no single chief or ruler, no formal hierarchy of power, just the natural emergence of influence based on demonstrated competence and earned respect. Conflict surely occurred as it occurs in every human society. People disagreed about decisions, competed for resources, nursed grievances, felt jealousy and resentment, and all the other emotions that cause friction between humans. But bands had to manage conflict without destroying themselves. Groups that dissolved into violence or fractured into hostile factions would have been at severe disadvantage in the Ice Age, unable to muster the cooperative effort that survival required. Conflict resolution mechanisms, whatever form they took, were essential to group survival. Some conflicts may have been resolved through discussion and mediation, with respected members of the band helping disputants find common ground or acceptable compromises. Some may have been resolved through ritualized competition, contests of skill or strength that allowed grievances to be settled without fatal violence. Some may have been resolved through separation, with losing parties leaving the band to join other groups where their status might be better, and some, inevitably, may have resulted in violence, in injuries or deaths that diminished the band's strength, and reminded everyone of the cost of uncontrolled conflict. Marriage was an important social institution, creating bonds between individuals that served multiple purposes. Marriage established partnerships for reproduction and child-rearing, ensuring that children had multiple adults committed to their survival. Marriage created alliances between families, reducing conflict within the band and strengthening ties of mutual obligation. Marriage connected bands to each other, as people married out and moved to join their spouses' groups, creating the larger networks that provided insurance against local disaster. Marriage rules varied from place to place and time to time, but most societies had rules that prohibited marriage between close relatives, while encouraging marriage between people from different bands. These rules prevented inbreeding while maintaining the genetic diversity necessary for long-term population health. Anthropologists call this pattern exogamy, marrying outside the immediate group, and it is one of the most common features of human social organization across cultures and time periods. Children, as I mentioned earlier, were precious and carefully raised, but childhood in the Ice Age was not like childhood today. There was no extended period of protected dependency, no years of education divorced from practical life. Children were integrated into the life of the band from their earliest years, learning through participation, contributing what they could, gradually taking on more responsibility as they grew in strength and skill. Adolescence was probably a time of transition, a period when young people prepared to take their place as full adult members of the community. For young men, this might involve proving themselves as hunters, demonstrating courage and skill in ways that earned adult status. For young women, this might involve puberty rituals and the assumption of adult roles in domestic production. The specific forms varied, but the function was universal, marking the transition from childhood dependency to adult contribution, clarifying expectations and celebrating new status. Elders held special positions in Ice Age society, as they do in most human societies. They possessed knowledge that could be acquired only through years of experience, memories of events and conditions that younger people had never seen. In a world without writing, elders were living libraries, repositories of information essential for survival. They knew where to find water in drought, where to find food when usual sources failed, how to cope with crises that occurred only once in a generation. Their memories were the band's collective memory, essential for navigating the unpredictable challenges of Ice Age existence. But elders were also burdens in some ways, mouths to feed when they could no longer contribute fully to their own support. Ice Age societies had to balance respect for elders against the practical realities of survival. Most probably supported their elders as long as resources allowed, honouring the obligations that elders had fulfilled when they were young, maintaining the social contract that promised care in old age in return for contribution during the productive years. But when resources became severely constrained, when supporting an elder meant not supporting a child, hard choices had to be made. These choices were probably agonizing, probably marked by grief and guilt, probably varied according to specific circumstances. We cannot know the details, but we can imagine the difficulty. Death was a constant presence in Ice Age life, more visible and immediate than in our modern world of hospitals and nursing homes and hidden dying. People died in camp surrounded by family, their final moments witnessed by those who loved them. Children died, partners died, parents died. Death was not a distant abstraction, but a frequent, intimate experience that everyone encountered repeatedly throughout their lives. The living had to cope with death, had to process grief, had to continue with the demands of survival, even when loss made them want to stop. Ice Age people developed rituals and beliefs that helped with this coping, ways of understanding death that made it meaningful rather than merely terrible. We know about these beliefs primarily through burial practices, the ways that Ice Age people treated their dead. Ice Age burials show clear patterns that suggest belief in some form of afterlife or continuing existence. Bodies were often positioned carefully, placed in particular orientations that may have had cosmological significance. They were often accompanied by grave goods, tools, ornaments, animal remains, red ochre pigment that may have symbolized blood or life. They were sometimes covered with flowers, a practice attested by pollen found in ancient graves, a gesture of grief and love that transcends the millennia between those mourners and us. The grave goods suggest that Ice Age people believed the dead might need their possessions in whatever came next, that death was a journey requiring equipment, that the deceased continued in some form that could use and appreciate material things. This belief, or something like it, appears in almost every human culture we know of. It seems to be a near-universal human response to death, a way of denying the finality of loss, of maintaining connection with those who have gone, of expressing love that continues beyond the grave. Let me tell you now about the changing climate within the Ice Age, about the fluctuations and variations that made survival even more challenging than a steady cold would have been. The Ice Age was not a single uniform period of cold. It was a complex time with its own rhythms and cycles, moments of greater and lesser severity, unpredictable shifts that could transform conditions within years or decades. The long-term cycles of ice ages are driven by variations in Earth's orbit around the Sun, changes that occur over periods of tens of thousands of years. But within these long cycles, shorter fluctuations created climate variability on timescales that humans could experience directly. Decades of relative warmth might be followed by decades of severe cold. Wet periods might alternate with dry periods. Conditions that had been stable for a generation might suddenly shift, requiring rapid adaptation to new circumstances. These shorter fluctuations were particularly challenging because they were unpredictable and often rapid. A cold snap might kill vegetation that people depended on, drive game away from familiar hunting grounds, make previously habitable areas suddenly unlivable. The people who survived were those who could adapt quickly, who had diverse skills and wide-ranging knowledge, who were not dependent on any single resource or strategy. Flexibility was essential. Ice Age people could not afford to be specialists, focused on a single type of food or a single type of environment. They had to be generalists capable of exploiting many different resources, able to shift strategies when conditions changed. This flexibility was built into Ice Age cultures: diverse toolkits, varied food sources, knowledge of multiple environments, willingness to move when staying became untenable. Movement was perhaps the ultimate adaptation. When local conditions became too harsh, when resources failed and survival became impossible, people moved. They abandoned territories that had supported them for generations, walked away from landscapes they knew intimately, sought better conditions in unfamiliar places. This mobility was costly, requiring the abandonment of accumulated knowledge about local resources, demanding the learning of entirely new environments. But it was also life-saving, allowing populations to escape conditions that would have killed them if they had stayed. The genetic evidence suggests that Ice Age human populations went through repeated expansions and contractions, growing when conditions permitted, shrinking when conditions demanded. These population fluctuations left their marks on modern human genetics, visible as variations in genetic diversity that reflect ancient population history. The smallest populations, the survivors of the harshest times, left less genetic variation. The expanding populations of better times left more. Reading these genetic signatures, modern scientists can reconstruct the outlines of Ice Age population history, seeing the pulses of growth and decline that characterized human existence through this challenging period. The last glacial maximum, around 26 to 19,000 years ago, was probably the time of greatest population contraction. The cold was most severe, the ice sheets most extensive, the habitable territory most reduced. Human populations in many regions declined dramatically, retreating to refugia where survival remained possible, abandoning vast territories that had once supported thriving communities. Europe was particularly affected, with populations withdrawing to southern areas and northern territories becoming essentially empty of humans. The refugia that sustained populations through the glacial maximum became crucibles of survival, places where Ice Age adaptations were tested to their limits, and only the most resilient survived. The people who emerged from these refugia when conditions improved were the descendants of the most successful Ice Age survivors, carriers of genetic variations and cultural traditions that had proved their worth in the harshest conditions imaginable. They would repopulate the vast territories that had been abandoned, spreading northward as the ice retreated, rebuilding populations that had been reduced to fragments. Let me tell you finally about the end of the Ice Age, about the warming that transformed the world and brought both opportunity and challenge to the descendants of Ice Age survivors. The warming began slowly, as climate changes usually do, almost imperceptibly at first, but building over centuries into transformation that changed everything. The ice sheets began to melt, releasing water that had been locked up for tens of thousands of years. Sea levels rose, slowly at first, then faster as the melting accelerated. Coastlines retreated, flooding lands that had been exposed during the glacial maximum, covering the land bridges that had connected continents and islands. The Bering Land Bridge disappeared beneath the rising waters, cutting the connection between Asia and America. The British Isles became islands again. Indonesia fragmented into the archipelago we know today. The world's geography was redrawn by the rising seas. On land, the changes were equally dramatic. Forests spread northward, replacing the grasslands and tundra that had dominated Ice Age landscapes. The mammoth steppe, that productive grassland ecosystem, fragmented and disappeared as trees invaded from the south. The great herds of Ice Age mammals declined, squeezed between shrinking habitat and continuing human hunting pressure. Mammoths, woolly rhinoceroses, giant deer, and dozens of other species went extinct, their disappearance marking the end of an era that had lasted millions of years. For humans, the changes brought both opportunity and loss. The warming climate opened vast new territories for settlement, lands that had been uninhabitable during the glacial maximum. Forests provided new resources, abundant wood for fuel and construction, nuts and fruits for gathering, forest animals for hunting. The warming also brought new challenges, unfamiliar environments requiring new adaptations, loss of the Ice Age animals that had provided so much of human sustenance, competition from growing populations filling the newly habitable lands. The people who lived through this transition had to reinvent themselves. The skills and knowledge that had served their ancestors for millennia became less relevant in a transformed world. New technologies had to be developed, new strategies adopted, new ways of life created. The transformation was gradual enough that it occurred across many generations, each generation adapting slightly to changing conditions, each passing on slightly modified traditions to their successors. But it was rapid by historical standards, transforming the world beyond recognition within a few thousand years. The end of the Ice Age was also the beginning of something new. Around 12,000 years ago, in parts of the Middle East, some human groups began experimenting with plant cultivation and animal domestication. This was the beginning of agriculture, the transformation that would ultimately give rise to cities and civilizations, to writing and science, to the modern world in all its complexity. The Ice Age survivors became the first farmers, though they did not know they were starting a revolution that would transform their descendants' existence beyond anything they could imagine. You are one of those descendants. The Ice Age runs through your ancestry, whether your family came from Europe or Asia or Africa or the Americas. Every human alive today carries the heritage of Ice Age survival, the genetic adaptations and cultural traditions that made it possible for our ancestors to survive when the world was frozen and death was always near. The warmth you enjoy, the abundance you eat, the security you feel, all of these rest on foundations laid by Ice Age people who had none of these things but who survived and adapted and passed on their strength to us. The night has grown deep. The story of the Ice Age has been told, from its frigid beginning to its warming end, from the challenges it posed to the adaptations humans developed, from the hardships of daily survival to the triumphs of art and society. You have walked with your ancestors through the frozen world, felt something of what they felt, understood something of what they achieved. Now it is time to rest as they rested, warm and safe for the moment, gathering strength for whatever tomorrow brings. Sleep now, child of the Ice Age. Sleep, descendant of survivors. The cold cannot reach you here, in your warm bed, in your warm room, in a world that your ancestors could never have imagined. But their strength is with you still, written in your genes, encoded in your culture, present in the resilience you carry without knowing its source. They faced the ice and won. Their victory is your inheritance. The fire burns low. The night is quiet. Somewhere outside, the world turns through its eternal cycles, the same cycles that once brought ice ages and will bring them again someday. But that is far in the future, and you are safe tonight, warm tonight, alive tonight because your ancestors were strong and clever and determined enough to survive the last Ice Age. Honor them with your rest. Honor them by being alive. Honor them by carrying forward the human story they fought so hard to continue. Dream of ice and snow, of mammoth hunts and cave paintings, of bone needles and warm furs and the endless work of survival. Dream of your ancestors, those distant heroes who lived and died so that you could be here. Dream and wake knowing that their strength lives on in you, that their story continues through you, that the Ice Age heritage is yours forever. Sleep well, survivor. Sleep well, inheritor. Sleep well, human being. The Ice Age made us what we are. Its challenges forged our resilience. Its hardships created our adaptability. Its demands produced our cooperation. We are children of the cold, masters of adversity, descendants of those who would not be defeated by any challenge the world could present. The morning will come. The day will bring its own challenges, but you will face them with Ice Age strength, with ancestral resilience, with the accumulated wisdom of 100,000 years of human survival. You are equal to whatever comes because you come from people who survived the Ice Age, and nothing you face can be harder than what they overcame. Good night, child of the ice. Good night, heir of the frozen world. Good night, and sleep well, and wake ready to continue the story your ancestors began so long ago, in a world of ice that they transformed through sheer determination into the world of warmth and possibility you inherit tonight. The Ice Age is over. The world is warm, and you are safe. Sleep now, dream now, rest now. Good night. Let me continue with more stories from the Ice Age, because there is so much more to tell about this frozen world and the remarkable people who survived it. The Ice Age was millions of stories, each life a journey through unimaginable challenges, each survival a small miracle that made the next generation possible. Consider the experience of cold itself, because we modern people rarely experience true cold, the kind that kills, the kind your ancestors knew intimately. When temperatures drop far below freezing, the world transforms in ways hard to describe. The air becomes sharp, almost painful to breathe. Each breath feels like inhaling needles, the cold penetrating deep into lungs. Moisture freezes on contact. Exhaled breath becomes ice on beards and hoods. Sweat becomes frost inside clothing. Tears freeze on cheeks before they can fall. The cold attacks the body systematically, targeting extremities first. Blood withdraws from fingers and toes, ears and nose, concentrating in the core to protect vital organs. This withdrawal saves lives but sacrifices peripheries. Frostbite begins when tissue freezes, cells rupturing, damage spreading if warming does not occur quickly enough. Ice Age people knew the signs of frostbite, knew the feeling of numbness that preceded danger, knew the necessity of constant vigilance. The cold affects the mind as well as the body. Hypothermia begins with shivering and confusion, progresses to disorientation and poor judgment, ends in unconsciousness and death if not reversed. Ice Age people knew these symptoms, knew that someone who stopped shivering was in mortal danger, knew the necessity of getting cold companions warmed immediately. Survival required constant awareness of body temperature, constant monitoring of self and others. The darkness of Ice Age winters added to the challenge. In northern regions, winter days were short, sometimes only a few hours of pale light before the sun sank again into endless night. For months, people lived primarily by firelight. Their world shrunk to small circles of warmth and illumination. This darkness affected everything. Travel became dangerous. Hunting became difficult. Work slowed when light was insufficient. Depression may have set in for some, the psychological weight of endless darkness that we now call seasonal affective disorder. Stories helped fill the darkness. The long winter nights were perfect for storytelling, gathered around the fire, warm and fed, with nothing to do but rest and wait for light's return. Elders told stories of the past, events they had witnessed, tales their own elders had told them. These stories transmitted knowledge across generations, teaching young people about dangers and opportunities, mistakes and successes, how to live in a world that did not forgive errors. Music and dance accompanied the stories, transforming telling into performance. Bone flutes found at Ice Age sites prove music existed, and where music exists, dance usually follows. People moved to rhythms, clapped hands, stamped feet, released energy building through long hours of confinement. Dancing provided exercise as well as entertainment, keeping bodies active during sedentary winter months. Let me tell you more about the great animals of the Ice Age, because human fate and animal fate were intertwined. The woolly mammoth was the icon of this era, central to Ice Age human life in many regions. A single mammoth provided tons of meat, enough to feed a band for weeks. Its hide-covered shelters, its bones built them. Its tusks became tools and art. Its fat fueled lamps pushing back darkness. The mammoth was a walking resource depot wrapped in shaggy brown fur. Mammoths were not easy prey. They stood 10 feet at the shoulder, weighed several tons, could crush a human with a single blow. They were intelligent, living in social groups that protected vulnerable members. Hunting mammoths required courage, coordination, sophisticated strategy. Not every hunt succeeded. Many hunters must have died, trampled or gored by animals that did not intend to be prey. When hunts succeeded, the whole band gathered to butcher the carcass, working for days to process all usable material. Meat was divided according to social rules, ensuring everyone received a share. The best parts went to successful hunters, to honoured elders, to pregnant women and nursing mothers. The rest was distributed more generally. Sharing was essential, because mammoth meat could not be preserved indefinitely. The woolly rhinoceros was another impressive Ice Age animal, massive and covered in thick fur, equipped with 2 horns for defence and clearing snow from vegetation. Woolly rhinos were solitary and aggressive, probably more dangerous to hunt than mammoths. But they were hunted. Their remains found at many Ice Age sites. The giant deer carried the largest antlers of any deer ever, spreading up to 12 feet tip to tip. These spectacular structures were shed and regrown yearly, a tremendous metabolic investment suggesting importance for mating displays. The giant deer went extinct at the Ice Age's end, unable to survive in the transformed world. Cave bears and cave lions shared Ice Age Europe with humans. These were distinct from modern bears and lions, larger and more robust, adapted to Ice Age conditions. They were dangerous to humans, competitors for shelter and prey, occasional predators. Ice Age people took precautions when entering caves, avoided confrontations that could prove fatal. Yet humans ultimately drove these predators to extinction through hunting and habitat change. The relationship between humans and animals was complex, involving not just predation but observation and perhaps reverence. Cave paintings show animals depicted with remarkable accuracy by artists who must have spent hours watching them. This was not merely practical observation, it suggests deeper engagement, appreciation beyond utility as food and material. Let me describe regional variations in Ice Age human life, because conditions varied enormously and human adaptations varied in response. In southwestern France, around the Dordogne Valley, Ice Age conditions were relatively mild. The Atlantic moderated temperatures. Limestone plateaus cut by river valleys offered numerous caves. Reindeer migrated through in enormous numbers, providing reliable seasonal resources. This region became a great centre of Ice Age culture, home to cave paintings of Lascaux, Altamira, and many other sites. Favourable conditions allowed populations to grow, creating communities with surplus time for art and cultural elaboration. The cave paintings demonstrate sophisticated aesthetic expression and symbolic thought. In Central and Eastern Europe, conditions were harsher. The Atlantic's influence did not reach inland. The landscape was open mammoth steppe with fewer natural shelters. Human populations were smaller, more mobile, following herds across vast territories, building shelters from mammoth bones. The mammoth bone settlements are architectural marvels, structures built from dozens of mammoth bones arranged with care and ingenuity. Some were occupied for generations, returning populations maintaining structures built by ancestors. In Siberia, conditions were harshest of all. Winter temperatures dropped far below anything in Western Europe. The landscape was treeless for vast distances, yet humans lived here, developing adaptations pushing technology's limits. Their clothing had to be more sophisticated, shelters more effective, food storage more reliable. Any failure could be fatal in an environment offering no second chances. From Siberian populations came the first Americans, people who walked across the Bering Land Bridge carrying Ice Age adaptations into continents that had never seen human footprints. Let me tell you about women in the Ice Age, because their contributions are often overlooked. Women were essential to Ice Age communities. They probably did most of the work making permanent habitation possible, preparing food for storage, making and maintaining clothing, managing domestic space that kept families alive through long winters. The bone needles so crucial to survival were probably made and used primarily by women. Sewing skills were passed from mothers to daughters, refined over generations until reaching remarkable sophistication. Fitted clothing was women's work, and without it survival would have been impossible. Women gathered plant foods, supplementing meat-focused diets with vitamins and variety. They processed food for preservation. They cared for children, maintaining community continuity across generations. Women's biological role in reproduction was obviously essential, but also created vulnerabilities. Pregnancy and childbirth were dangerous, nutrition sometimes inadequate, healthcare non-existent by modern standards. Yet women gave birth again and again, maintaining population despite losses. Let me tell you about children and learning, because every skill and piece of knowledge had to be transmitted from one generation to the next. Children learned by watching and doing, participating in community life from earliest years. They watched adults make tools, noting techniques of stone knapping and bone working. They accompanied adults on foraging expeditions, learning to identify edible plants and track animal signs. They listened to stories encoding practical knowledge in memorable forms. By adolescence, Ice Age children contributed meaningfully to survival. Young men joined hunting parties, gradually taking on more responsibility. Young women took up women's work, preparing food and making clothing. Learning continued throughout life, adults adding new skills as circumstances demanded. The learning process created deep relationships between teachers and students, bonds complementing kinship ties. A young hunter might revere the older hunter who taught him skills. These teaching relationships created networks of obligation and affection binding the community together. Consider a typical Ice Age day in a winter camp. Dawn comes late, the sun appearing briefly above the southern horizon before sinking again. The family stirs in their shelter of mammoth bones and hides. The fire has burned low but still glows with embers. The first task is rebuilding the fire, adding fuel and blowing gently until flames appear. Breakfast is simple: dried meat, perhaps some fat for concentrated energy. Food is fuel, consumed quickly so day's work can begin. The adults assess priorities. Food supplies are adequate but will need replenishment. A hunting party should go out. Clothing needs repair. Tools need maintenance. The list is endless, but priorities must be set. The men prepare for hunting. They dress carefully, checking each layer of clothing. They gather weapons, spears with stone points, atlatl throwers, knives for butchering. They pack minimal supplies, some food, fire-making materials, cordage. The women stay in camp. One begins repairs on torn garments. Another continues work on a new parka for a growing child. A third processes food for storage, cutting meat into strips for drying, rendering fat. Children help where they can. Even young children have tasks: gathering fuel, fetching water, watching younger siblings. Education is constant but informal, woven into daily life. The hunters return in late afternoon as daylight fades. Today brought moderate success. 2 rabbits from snares, a fish speared through ice. Not a major kill, but enough to supplement stored food, enough fresh meat for evening's meal. Evening is social time, the whole band gathering around the fire. The rabbits are butchered and roasted. Everyone eats, sharing according to need. Someone brings out a bone flute and plays simple melody. Others listen, talk quietly, work on tasks done by firelight. Children gradually fall asleep. Adults stay up later, maintaining fire, keeping watch, enjoying evening's peace. Eventually everyone sleeps. The fire burns low but does not go out entirely. Someone will wake periodically to add fuel. Outside, the Ice Age world continues. Wind blowing snow, predators hunting, stars wheeling overhead. Inside, the family sleeps, safe for now, alive for another day. This was Ice Age life. Not constant crisis, but not easy either. The balance between security and danger, sufficiency and scarcity, life and death, was always present. Every meal was a small victory. Every night survived was a small triumph. Every child who grew to adulthood was a miracle. Let me tell you about the animals that shared the Ice Age world with humans, the megafauna whose existence shaped human life and whose extinction marked the age's end. These were not ordinary animals, but giants, creatures of sizes we can barely imagine, roaming landscapes we can barely reconstruct. The steppe bison was larger than modern bison, with horns spanning 6 feet or more. Herds of these animals darkened the plains, providing essential resources for human hunters. They were wary and fast, difficult to approach, dangerous when cornered. Hunting them required strategy and cooperation. The horse of the Ice Age was different from modern horses, stockier and hardier, adapted to extreme cold. Horses were important prey for Ice Age hunters, depicted frequently in cave paintings. They may have held special significance beyond their practical value as food. Reindeer were perhaps the most important prey in many regions. They migrated in enormous herds, predictable movements that Ice Age people learned and exploited. The seasonal reindeer hunts were major events, opportunities to stockpile food and materials for months ahead. Musk oxen survived the Ice Age and live today in Arctic regions, living fossils from the glacial world. Their wool, kiviot, is among the warmest natural fibres known. Ice Age people who hunted musk oxen may have used this wool for insulation. The predators of the Ice Age were formidable. Wolves hunted in packs, intelligent and persistent. Cave hyenas competed with humans for prey and shelter. The short-faced bear of the Americas was one of the largest bears ever, capable of running down prey on the open plains. These predators were both competitors and dangers. Ice Age people had to protect their kills from scavengers, guard their camps from predators attracted by food smells, avoid confrontations that could prove fatal. The Ice Age world was not empty wilderness, but a complex ecosystem where humans had to find their place among other powerful species. Most of these animals are gone now, extinct at the Ice Age's end or shortly after. The mammoths vanished. The woolly rhinos, the giant deer, the cave bears and lions. Only fragments remain. Bones in museums, images on cave walls, genetic traces in surviving relatives. The Ice Age world of megafauna is lost forever, existing only in reconstruction and imagination. The extinctions were probably caused by some combination of climate change and human hunting pressure. As the Ice Age ended and habitats transformed, animal populations were stressed. Human hunting added additional pressure, pushing vulnerable species over the edge. The result was a mass extinction that eliminated most of the large animals that had dominated Ice Age landscapes. Humans survived this extinction, adapted to the new post-glacial world, developed new hunting strategies for smaller, faster prey. The descendants of Ice Age mammoth hunters became the hunters of deer and elk, eventually becoming the farmers and herders whose descendants populate the world today. Let me tell you about the spiritual life of Ice Age people, because humans have never survived by physical means alone. We need meaning and purpose, connection, and hope. Ice Age people had rich inner lives, beliefs and practices that sustained them through hardships. The cave paintings suggest complex symbolic thought. No one paints on cave walls merely to survive. Art requires investment in something beyond physical necessity, in beauty and expression and meaning. Ice Age people created art because humans need to express themselves, because there is something in our nature demanding more than mere existence. The burials suggest beliefs about death and afterlife. Treating dead with care, providing grave goods, covering bodies with ochre, these practices serve no practical survival purpose. They reflect attempts to maintain connection with those who have gone, expressions of love transcending the material world. Religious belief probably existed, though its specific forms are lost. Every human society has religious beliefs of some kind. Ice Age people almost certainly had such beliefs, giving meaning to existence, explaining the unexplainable, providing comfort in the face of hardship. The meaning Ice Age people found in their lives sustained them through conditions that would have crushed people without hope. It gave them reasons to continue when continuing was difficult, purposes making the endless work of survival worthwhile. The Ice Age ended around 12,000 years ago. The warming began slowly, building over centuries into transformation, changing everything. Ice sheets melted, releasing water locked up for tens of thousands of years. Sea levels rose, coastlines retreated, flooding lands exposed during the glacial maximum. Land bridges disappeared beneath rising waters. On land, forests spread northward, replacing grasslands and tundra. The mammoth steppe fragmented and disappeared as trees invaded. The great Ice Age mammals declined, squeezed between shrinking habitat and human hunting pressure. Within a few thousand years, most were extinct. For humans, changes brought both opportunity and loss. Warming opened vast new territories. Forests provided new resources, but warming also brought challenges. Unfamiliar environments, loss of Ice Age animals, competition from growing populations. The people who lived through this transition had to reinvent themselves. Ice Age skills and knowledge became less relevant in a transformed world. New technologies had to be developed, new strategies adopted, new ways of life created. And eventually, some groups began experimenting with agriculture. This was the beginning of the transformation that would create cities and civilizations, writing and science, the modern world in all its complexity. The Ice Age survivors became the first farmers, unknowingly starting a revolution transforming their descendants' existence beyond imagination. You are one of those descendants. The Ice Age runs through your ancestry. Every human alive today carries the heritage of Ice Age survival. The warmth you enjoy, the abundance you eat, the security you feel, all rest on foundations laid by Ice Age people who had none of these things but survived and adapted and passed on their strength to us. The night has grown deep. The Ice Age story has been told, from its challenges to its triumphs, from daily survival routines to transcendent achievements of art and meaning. You have walked with your ancestors through the frozen world. Now it is time to rest. Sleep now, child of the Ice Age. Sleep, descendant of survivors. The cold cannot reach you here, in your warm bed, in your warm room. But their strength is with you still, written in your genes, encoded in your culture, present in the resilience you carry without knowing its source. They faced the ice and won. Their victory is your inheritance. The fire burns low. The night is quiet. The Ice Age is over, but its legacy lives on in you. Honor your ancestors. Remember their struggle. Sleep in the knowledge that you come from people who could not be broken. Dream of ice and fire, of mammoth hunts and cave paintings, of bone needles and warm furs and the endless work of survival. Dream of your ancestors, those distant relatives who lived and died so you could live. Dream and wake knowing that their strength is your strength, their story is your story. The morning will come, the world will present its challenges, and you will face them with the resilience of your ancestors, descendants of those who survived the Ice Age. Good night, child of the ice. Good night, heir of the frozen world. Good night, and sleep well. The Ice Age made us what we are. Its challenges forged our resilience. Its hardships created our adaptability. Its demands produced our cooperation. We are children of the cold, masters of adversity, descendants of those who would not be defeated. Sleep well, survivor. Sleep well, inheritor. Sleep well, human being. The Ice Age is over. The world is warm, and you are safe. Good night. Let me tell you even more about this frozen world, because the details matter, because understanding what your ancestors endured helps you understand who you are and where you come from. The Ice Age was not a brief episode, but a way of life that lasted longer than all of recorded human history, a crucible that forged the humanity you inherit tonight. Consider the making of fire, that essential technology that made Ice Age survival possible. Fire was life. Without fire, there was no warmth in the freezing nights, no light in the endless darkness, no way to cook food or harden spear points or signal to distant companions. Fire was the first and most important tool, the foundation on which all other Ice Age adaptations were built. But fire does not make itself. It must be created, nurtured, protected, maintained. Ice Age people had to master fire completely, had to understand it intimately, had to be able to create it reliably even in the most challenging conditions. This mastery was hard-won, developed over countless generations of trial and error, passed down through teaching relationships that ensured the knowledge was never lost. The bow drill was probably the most reliable fire-starting method in Ice Age conditions. A spindle of hardwood, rotated rapidly by a bow, created friction against a fireboard, generating heat that eventually produced an ember. This ember, carefully transferred to a bundle of tinder, could be blown into flame. The process required skill and preparation. The right woods, properly dried and shaped, the right tinder, the right technique. A skilled firemaker could produce flame in minutes. An unskilled one might fail entirely, with potentially fatal consequences. Fire had to be maintained once started. Letting the fire go out was a serious matter, requiring the effort and risk of starting a new one. Someone always watched the fire, adding fuel as needed, banking it at night so embers would survive until morning. The firekeeper was an important role, often assigned to elders or others who could not participate in more strenuous activities. Fire also had to be transported when groups moved. Carrying a burning brand or a smouldering piece of punk fungus was easier than starting fresh, especially in wet or windy conditions. The fire carrier walked carefully, protecting the precious ember from wind and rain, delivering it safely to the next camp where it could be coaxed back into flame. Let me tell you about the sounds of the Ice Age, because we tend to imagine the past as silent, but it was not. The Ice Age world had its own soundscape, its own symphony of natural and human sounds that filled the air and shaped the experience of those who lived within it. The wind was constant on the open steppe, a low moan or high howl depending on conditions, carrying snow and cold, never completely silent. People learned to read the wind, to predict weather by its changes, to orient themselves by its direction. The wind was companion and adversary, always present, always demanding attention. The animals added their voices. Mammoths trumpeted, deep resonant calls that carried for miles across the open landscape. Wolves howled at night, their chorus rising and falling, marking territory and coordinating pack movements. Birds called and sang, even in the cold, their voices marking the seasons and the hours of the day. Human sounds filled the camps. Voices in conversation, laughter, argument, storytelling. The rhythmic thud of stone on stone as tools were made. The scrape of hide scrapers preparing leather. The crackle of fire. The hiss of meat cooking. The clatter of bones being worked. Children crying and playing. Dogs barking if dogs had already been domesticated, which some evidence suggests they had been. Music was part of the soundscape. The bone flutes could produce haunting melodies, high notes piercing the cold air. Drums of stretched hide provided rhythm for dancing and ceremony. Voices rose in songs whose words and melodies are lost to us, but which must have existed. Because singing exists in every human culture we know of. The silence of the Ice Age was different from modern silence. There were no machine sounds, no electrical hums, no distant traffic. When human activity ceased, when the wind dropped and the animals were quiet, the silence was profound, deeper and more complete than most modern people ever experience. This silence could be peaceful or frightening, depending on circumstances. In safety, it was rest. In danger, it was tension, the quiet before something happened. Let me tell you about water in the Ice Age, because water was essential for survival, but not always easy to obtain. In winter, water froze. Streams and ponds became solid ice. Rivers developed thick frozen surfaces, the water locked away and unavailable. Obtaining drinking water required effort, melting snow or ice over fire, chopping holes through frozen surfaces, finding the rare springs that ran warm enough to remain liquid. Snow could be eaten directly, but this was inefficient and dangerous. Eating snow lowered body temperature, forcing the body to expend precious calories warming itself. It was better to melt snow first, to warm it before drinking, to avoid the thermal shock of ice-cold water entering the body. This meant that drinking water was tied to fire, another dependency on that essential technology. In summer, water was more available but not always safe. Standing water could harbour parasites and diseases. Flowing water was generally safer, and Ice Age people probably learned to prefer running streams and rivers to stagnant ponds. They may have developed methods of purifying water, though direct evidence is lacking. Water had to be carried when travelling away from sources. Animal bladders and stomachs made serviceable water containers, their natural waterproof linings holding liquid without leaking. These containers were fragile and had to be treated carefully, but they allowed people to range away from water sources for days at a time. Let me tell you about the injuries and illnesses of Ice Age life, because the Ice Age was dangerous and people were often hurt. Hunting accidents were common: a charging mammoth, a slipping spear, a fall on icy ground. The daily work of survival involved sharp tools and physical exertion, opportunities for cuts and strains and broken bones. Ice Age people had medical knowledge, though it was different from modern medicine. They knew how to set broken bones, splinting them with sticks and wrapping them with hide to immobilize while healing occurred. They knew how to clean and dress wounds, how to use plant materials for poultices and treatments. They may have known about medicinal plants, though the evidence is limited. What they did not have was antibiotics, antiseptics, surgery, anesthesia, or any of the other tools of modern medicine. Infections that would be easily treated today could be fatal. Injuries that modern medicine would repair could result in permanent disability. Childbirth complications that are routine in modern hospitals could kill mother, child, or both. The people who survived Ice Age injuries were the lucky ones, the ones whose wounds healed cleanly, whose bones set properly, whose infections did not spread. Many others died of injuries and illnesses that would be trivial today. The Ice Age took a toll in pain and death that we can barely imagine from our comfortable modern perspective. Yet people also cared for each other. Archaeological evidence shows individuals who survived severe injuries, people who must have been unable to care for themselves during long recovery periods. Someone fed them, protected them, helped them heal. This caring is perhaps the most human of all Ice Age behaviours, the willingness to invest in those who could not immediately reciprocate, the recognition that today's dependent might be tomorrow's helper. Let me tell you about the seasonal rhythms of Ice Age life, because time had different meaning when survival depended on natural cycles. The year was divided not into months and weeks, but into seasons of abundance and scarcity, warmth and cold, activity and rest. Spring was awakening. The sun returned, days lengthened, temperatures rose, snow melted, revealing the ground beneath, releasing water that flowed in streams and rivers. Animals gave birth, providing vulnerable young that were easier to hunt. Plants began to grow, offering fresh food after months of stored provisions. Spring was hope, the promise of easier times ahead. Summer was abundance. The sun shone for long hours, sometimes barely setting in northern regions. Animals were fat from summer grazing, plants were producing fruit and seeds. This was the time for gathering and storing, for building up reserves against the lean times ahead. Summer was work, relentless activity to take advantage of favourable conditions. Fall was preparation, Days shortened, temperatures dropped, the first snows appeared on distant mountains. Animals grew winter coats, migrated to winter ranges, prepared for the coming cold. Humans did the same, finishing stored food preparations, completing warm clothing, making sure shelters were ready for winter. Fall was anxiety, awareness of approaching hardship. Winter was endurance. The sun appeared briefly if at all. Temperatures plunged. Snow covered everything. This was the time of stored food and warm clothing, of shelter and fire and waiting. Activity was limited to essential tasks. Energy was conserved. Stories were told. The community drew together for warmth and support. Winter was survival, getting through until spring returned. These seasonal rhythms shaped Ice Age culture and psychology. People knew what each season brought, anticipated its challenges, prepared for its demands. The seasons were not just weather but chapters in an ongoing story, recurring themes in a narrative that stretched across generations. Let me tell you about old age in the Ice Age, because elders faced particular challenges and held particular roles. Old age was rarer than today, because fewer people survived the accidents and illnesses of youth and middle age. Those who did survive to old age were exceptional, survivors of a selection process that eliminated many of their contemporaries. Elders held knowledge that could be acquired only through long experience. They remembered events that younger people had never seen, the great storm of decades past, the plague that killed so many, the year the reindeer failed to come. This knowledge was essential for navigating the unpredictable challenges of Ice Age existence. But elders also faced declining physical abilities. They could not hunt as effectively, could not travel as far, could not work as hard. In a society where everyone needed to contribute to survival, this created tensions. How much could the community support those who could not fully support themselves? Most Ice Age societies probably honoured their elders, recognising their contributions over a lifetime, respecting their knowledge, caring for them in their final years. The evidence of careful burials suggests that death was treated with dignity, that people who had contributed to the community were remembered and honoured even after they were gone. But hard times may have forced hard choices. When resources were severely limited, when supporting an elder meant not supporting a child, decisions had to be made. We cannot know how these decisions were handled, but we can imagine the difficulty, the grief, the necessity. Let me tell you about the dogs of the Ice Age, because dogs may have been part of Ice Age human life, the first domesticated animals, companions in the struggle for survival. The evidence is debated, but some archaeological sites suggest that wolves were being domesticated into dogs as early as the late Ice Age, perhaps 15,000 years ago or more. Dogs would have been valuable companions in Ice Age conditions. They could help with hunting, tracking prey, holding animals at bay until hunters arrived. They could guard camps, warning of approaching predators or strangers. They could carry small loads, freeing human hands for other tasks. They could provide warmth, sleeping close to humans on cold nights. The relationship between humans and dogs may have begun with wolves scavenging around human camps, learning that humans meant food scraps and discarded bones. The least aggressive wolves, the ones most comfortable around humans, would have had advantages. Over generations, selection for tameness produced animals that were increasingly different from wild wolves, increasingly dependent on humans, increasingly useful as companions and workers. If dogs were present in Ice Age camps, they would have been part of the social fabric, named individuals with personalities, mourned when they died. The relationship between humans and dogs is one of the oldest and deepest connections between our species and another, a partnership that has lasted for thousands of years and continues today. Let me tell you about the landscape of the Ice Age, because the world looked different then, different in ways that are hard to imagine from our modern perspective. The ice sheets themselves were enormous, walls of ice rising hundreds of feet, extending for thousands of miles, covering lands that are now green and temperate. At the margins of the ice, the landscape was transformed. Meltwater cut channels and valleys, deposited debris in long ridges called moraines, created lakes that filled and drained unpredictably. The ground near the ice was often boggy in summer, frozen solid in winter, difficult to traverse in any season. Beyond the ice margins, the mammoth steppe stretched endlessly, grassland and tundra supporting enormous herds of grazing animals. This was not empty wilderness, but a productive ecosystem, teeming with life, supporting predators and prey in numbers we can barely imagine. The coastlines were different because sea levels were so much lower. Lands that are now underwater were dry and habitable. The North Sea was a vast lowland plain, called Doggerland by archaeologists, where Ice Age people hunted and gathered until the rising seas flooded it forever. Similar lost lands existed along every coast, territories that supported human populations for millennia and then vanished beneath the waves. Rivers flowed differently, their courses shaped by ice and meltwater, their levels fluctuating with the seasons and the climate cycles. Some rivers carried enormous floods during periods of rapid melting, their channels cutting deeply into the landscape. Others dried up entirely when their water sources froze. The vegetation was different, distribution shifted by the cold climate. Trees that now grow in temperate regions were pushed south to Mediterranean refugia. Tundra and steppe covered lands that now support forests. The plant communities of the Ice Age have no exact modern equivalents, combinations of species that no longer coexist. Let me tell you about the night sky of the Ice Age, because the stars were the same stars we see today, wheeling overhead in their eternal patterns, providing guidance and wonder to people who spent long hours watching them. Ice Age people knew the stars intimately, knew their patterns and movements, used them for navigation and timekeeping. The night sky would have been clearer than we usually see today, without light pollution to dim the stars, without smog to obscure the view. The Milky Way would have blazed across the sky, a river of light marking the plane of our galaxy. Countless stars would have been visible that are invisible in modern cities. Ice Age people probably had names and stories for the constellations, though these are lost to us. They may have tracked the movements of planets, noticed the phases of the moon, predicted eclipses. The sky was a source of practical information for scheduling activities and finding direction, but it was probably also a source of wonder and spiritual meaning. The aurora borealis, the northern lights, would have been visible in many Ice Age regions, especially during periods of high solar activity. These dancing lights, green and purple and red, would have been interpreted through cultural frameworks we can only guess at. Were they spirits of the dead? Messages from gods? Natural phenomena to be observed and predicted? We cannot know, but we can be sure they were noticed and thought about. Let me tell you finally about the continuity between Ice Age people and ourselves, because we are not separate from them but continuous with them, inheritors of their genes and their cultures, descendants in an unbroken line stretching back through the frozen millennia. The languages we speak descend from languages spoken by Ice Age ancestors, change beyond recognition but connected by continuous evolution. The social structures we inhabit descend from Ice Age social patterns, elaborated and transformed but rooted in that ancient experience. The beliefs we hold, the stories we tell, the art we create, all have roots in Ice Age culture, however distant and mediated. Even our psychology bears Ice Age marks. Our fears and desires, our social instincts, our ways of thinking about the world, all were shaped by Ice Age selection pressures, by survival challenges that favoured certain psychological traits over others. We are Ice Age minds in a modern world, adapted for challenges that no longer exist but carrying adaptive equipment that still influences our behaviour. The Ice Age is not just past, it is present, in us, shaping who we are even as we are unaware of its influence. Understanding the Ice Age helps us understand ourselves, reveals the deep roots of human nature, connects us to ancestors whose struggles made our existence possible. You are an Ice Age being. Your body, your mind, your culture, all carry Ice Age heritage. The warmth you seek, the community you crave, the meaning you search for, all reflect Ice Age imperatives, survival needs that were burned into humanity during 100,000 years of frozen challenge. Rest now in that knowledge. Sleep with the awareness that you carry Ice Age strength within you. Whatever challenges tomorrow brings, you face them with ancestral resources, with adaptations forged in the coldest times, with resilience proven against the harshest conditions. The Ice Age made us. We carry it with us, and we pass it on to those who come after, adding our own contributions to a heritage that stretches back to the beginning of humanity and forward to its unknown end. The night is quiet now. The Ice Age story has been told in full, every detail offered that could bring that frozen world to life, every connection drawn between those ancient people and you. The fire burns low, the stars wheel overhead, the world sleeps. Sleep now, child of the Ice Age. Sleep, inheritor of frozen millennia. Sleep and wake knowing who you are and where you come from. The ancestors are with you. Their strength is your strength. Their survival is your existence. Good night, survivor. Good night, inheritor. Good night, human being shaped by ice, forged by cold, tempered by challenges beyond imagining. Sleep well. The morning will come, and you will face it with Ice Age resilience, with ancestral courage, with the accumulated strength of 100,000 years of human determination. The Ice Age is over, but its children live on, including you. Good night.